It started out as an ordinary call. Just another quiet, dusty access road somewhere in rural Oregon. But the moment Officer Mark Dalton climbed out of his patrol vehicle, his K-9 unit, Frank, did something unusual. He froze, absolutely still. No sniffing, no wandering. Just a low, steady growl, followed by a sharp bark directed straight at the ground. Not toward a person, not toward a noise, just the earth below. That's when Mark noticed it. A tiny piece of rusted metal, barely poking through the moss-covered floor. At first glance, it could have been junk, but as Mark swept aside the loose soil with his glove, a chill traveled down his spine. This wasn't garbage. It was a clue. A silent piece of something long forgotten. In fact, something that had been hidden for 14 years. That morning started like countless others. A resident had phoned in, reporting an old blue pickup parked suspiciously along a distant, neglected ranger path in the Cascade foothills. No crime, no evident threat, just strange. So Officer Dalton and Frank went to take a look. By the time they reached the area, the truck was gone. But Frank wasn't ready to leave. While heading back to the cruiser, Mark noticed Frank stop abruptly. His frame stiffened. His ears perked. Mark recognized that stance. Frank had detected something. But there were no footsteps, no broken branches, no wildlife sounds, only dense trees and filtered light. Then Frank barked once, loud, intentional, aimed straight at a patch of moss no wider than a pizza box. Mark walked over, knelt, and moved some debris. His glove scraped against a hard surface, metallic, rough. What he found made his heart skip. A rusted, bent license plate, warped to the point of almost being unreadable except for 2 letters still visible. Co. That was enough. Mark had seen those characters once before during a case review he barely remembered. It was buried deep, deeper even than this forest floor. Back at the precinct, Mark ran the letters through the DMV database, then cross-referenced the results with long-standing unsolved files. One result stopped him cold. The year 2009, the missing. The Campbell family. Henry, Lisa, and their 2 children, Jordan and Emily, vanished during a summer road trip through Oregon. Last sighting? Leaving a diner in Elk Creek, headed toward a campground. But they never arrived. No phone activity, no sightings, no vehicle, no closure. After 6 months, their file went cold. The match with the old license plate was weak. But the timeline and car model, a blue Dodge Caravan, fit eerily well. Mark took his findings to his captain, hoping it would prompt an investigation, maybe even FBI involvement. Instead, he got a weary sigh and a closed file slapped in his lap. It's been 14 years, Dalton. Could be scrap from an old work truck. Move on. But Mark couldn't. Not with Frank pacing near the exit. Not with that growl echoing in his memory. That weekend, off-duty, no badge, no radio, just gloves, a camera, and one determined officer. Mark returned with Frank. They parked half a mile from the scene and trekked in. Humidity still clung to the woods despite the late summer air. But the second they reached the site, Frank's demeanor changed. His nose hit the ground, followed by sharp zigzags, sniffs, and sudden halts. Bark. Frank's paw broke the soil. He began digging. Mark dropped beside him, brushing aside debris and soil until a fragmented piece of blue plastic emerged. Lightly melted, jagged, and sun-bleached at the edges. When flipped, white letters were barely visible. Aravan, part of a Dodge badge, not just trash. Evidence. Mark backed up and scanned the forest. Towering trees surrounded them. The calm wasn't peaceful, it was haunting. Somewhere nearby, a family vanished. And finally, someone was listening. That night, Mark dove back into the Campbell case. One interview stood out. A gas station attendant had mentioned the family asking for directions to Elk Creek campground. But the route she gave had been closed for over a year, taken out by a landslide. That road. The same path Mark and Frank had explored. He contacted a retired forestry ranger who confirmed it. That trail used to be a logging path, long forgotten by 2009. Still, older GPS systems occasionally routed drivers there as a shortcut to nowhere. If the Campbells had mistakenly followed that path, they could have slipped, crashed, gone off-road without a soul seeing it happen. If the terrain dropped abruptly, the van could have disappeared beneath brush and branches, erased by time. But Frank wasn't done. 2 days later they returned, heading even deeper this time, past the known trail. Rocks, unstable ground, soft soil mixed with ivy and blackberry vines made the journey rough. But Frank stopped near an old leaning tree and began sniffing with purpose. Mark watched. Whining, Frank scratched near a loose patch of dirt. Mark joined him. Under only a few inches of soil, more debris, broken glass, a cracked lens, maybe a headlight, maybe a camera. Mark bagged it, took photos, and recorded GPS data. It wasn't a body, it wasn't the van, but it was a path back to the truth. That night, in his kitchen, Mark stared out into the dark, Frank nearby, tail twitching in his sleep. This wasn't a department case anymore. It was his and Frank's. A family took the wrong turn 14 years ago. One dog just found the trail they left behind. The woods had a silence, not the kind shaped by wind or wildlife, but something heavier. Mark Dalton felt it every time he stepped off the track. A pressure in the air, like time itself had forgotten these woods. Frank stayed focused, every movement deliberate. Nose to the ground, tail low, steps cautious. Mark followed, saying nothing. Each crunch of a pine cone, each loose stone echoed like a warning. Frank would pause, sniff, and continue. No backup, no dispatch, just gut instinct and canine intuition. The further they went, the more sure Mark became. Something had happened here, long ago but not erased. 2 nights earlier they'd found fragments. A bumper, a lens. Mark hadn't logged them. He wrapped them, zip-locked them, and stored them beside last week's groceries. Policy said evidence had to be reported, but the department dismissed it. And Mark wasn't about to let this sit. Near a slope that dropped into a wild tangle of vines, blackberry bushes, and rocks, Frank slowed again. The ridge fell sharply about 30 feet and vanished into bramble. Nothing obvious, just wilderness. But Frank was locked in, barked once. Brief, focused. Mark stepped up beside him, saw nothing at first. Frank let out a low whine, circling a loose patch of soft earth. Mark knelt, pressing his fingers into the dirt. It sunk easily, fresh, disturbed. "Frank," he whispered. "What is it, boy?" No answer, of course, but the German shepherd's posture said enough. Ears high, eyes sharp, breathing deep. He wasn't looking. He was reading, decoding, the ground beneath their feet. Mark tied a strip of orange ribbon from his bag around a nearby branch. He didn't want to disturb the area too much without proper gear or backup, but whatever was hiding in that earth, he knew it was important. That night, Mark found himself in his dimly lit garage, the overhead bulb off, the glow of his laptop casting shadows across stacks of aging reports and photocopied documents. He'd tracked down the retired officer who originally filed the Campbell family's missing persons report back in 2009. The man, now living in Idaho, still remembered the case vividly. Family of 4 vanished in a minivan. "Never made it to their campsite," he said over the phone. "We thought they might have crashed, but there were no signs, no debris, no phone signals after Elk Creek. It was like they vanished into thin air." Mark told him about the license plate fragment, the bumper piece, and Frank's strange reaction. The old officer went quiet for a long moment. "Then you might be onto something, son. I always figured they took the wrong road." "What road?" Mark asked. "Old Cutler Ridge Trail," the officer replied. "It used to be a logging path. Closed down years earlier after small landslides. It's not even on the main maps anymore, but back in the day, GPS could have sent them that way." Mark leaned back in his chair. That was it. That was the trail Frank had guided him to. The forgotten road, lost to maps, overlooked for years. The next morning, Mark made a quiet call to someone he trusted. Carla Green, a local ranger who wasn't law enforcement, but knew the Cascade terrain better than anyone. They met just after sunrise at the beginning of the old trail. Frank was already pacing anxiously in the back seat. "What exactly are we supposed to be finding?" Carla asked. "A trail," Mark said. "Possibly something a lot more serious." He didn't say bodies. He didn't have to. They followed Frank back toward the ridge he had signaled the day before. Carla brought a collapsible stick for probing and a handheld GPS to mark coordinates. When Frank reached that same patch of soft earth, he sniffed again, barked once. That was all Mark needed. Together, they started pulling back the brush, gently clearing perhaps 3 inches of soil, careful with every movement. Half an hour later, Mark's shovel hit something solid. He paused. Kneeling, he wiped away more dirt with his gloved hands. A curved blue surface appeared, metallic, unmistakable. Carla knelt beside him, eyes wide, speaking in hushed tones. That's not rock. Mark pulled out a rag and cleaned the area more thoroughly. The edge of a taillight peeked through the caked soil. It was a vehicle. Frank circled the nearest tree and sat, posture upright, watching like a sentry. "What now?" Carla asked quietly. Mark let out a breath. "Now we make the call." He reached for his radio. Within the hour, 2 county deputies were on site. Shortly behind them came a forensics team and a representative from the state police. The team roped off the scene, secured the perimeter, and began drafting an excavation procedure. By protocol, the entire spot would be treated as a potential crime scene. Mark handed over the evidence: the broken lens, the plastic bumper shard, and the photo of the rusted license plate. Then he glanced down at Frank, who waited patiently just outside the caution tape. "You found them, buddy," Mark whispered, running a hand gently over the dog's fur. "You really found them." That night, Mark's mind wouldn't rest. He kept thinking of the Campbell family. Were they still inside that van? Hidden beneath the forest's silence for more than 10 years? It had taken a dog to lead them to the place where no one else thought to look, where no one had cared enough to search. Mark poured himself a bourbon, sat on the back porch under the night sky, and stared into the trees. Frank settled at his side, resting his head near Mark's boot. Mark couldn't shake the feeling. There was still more to this answer. They'd found the van. Yes, but the full story, that was still waiting in the woods. By midweek, Mark had already gone back several times to the Cascade foothills, each time branching wider from the initial discovery spot. Frank continued leading with purpose, nose to the ground, eyes alert. On the 4th return, something changed. This time, Frank didn't just search, he locked in. They were weaving through what appeared to be an old trail, barely visible through the thick layer of fallen needles, wild overgrowth, and shadowed underbrush. Mark figured it might have once served as a logging access road, maybe back in the 1980s, but now it was little more than a memory carved into the earth. They passed fallen trees, faint animal prints, and what looked like a long-abandoned burrow. Then, Frank's posture changed. Shoulders tense, tail stiff, head low. "Easy, boy," Mark said under his breath. Frank crept ahead cautiously and stopped at a cluster of moss-covered rocks. He sniffed, whined, circled, and then began digging at the soil with unmistakable urgency. Mark dropped to his knees and pushed away the debris and leaves, hands brushing aside the pine needles. Something was there, half buried beneath the topsoil. Just below the layer where pine needles met dirt was a plastic lens, foggy, scuffed beyond recognition, but unmistakably from an old throwaway camera, the kind you'd grab last minute at a gas station before a long weekend. Mark's chest tightened as he slipped on a fresh pair of gloves and carefully placed the piece into a Ziploc bag. There wasn't a full camera, only fragments. A lens, part of the film casing, and what looked like a melted corner of a sticker. The label bore the faint logo of a photo shop once based in Eugene, the same city the Campbell family had passed through before they vanished over a decade ago. It could have been coincidence, but Mark had learned something about working with Frank. Frank didn't believe in coincidences. He followed evidence. Later that night, Mark sat at his kitchen table beneath the amber glow of a low-hanging pendant light. Laid out in front of him were the clues: the broken license plate, the bent bumper piece, the cracked bit of lens. Frank lay nearby on the floor, head resting on his crossed paws, eyes silently studying Mark's every movement. The pieces didn't make sense yet. Families don't just disappear into the air, not without a footprint, not without a sign, unless someone or something never intended for them to be found. The next morning, Mark showed the new evidence to someone who might understand. Doug Whitman, a seasoned and now retired forensic photographer who'd worked dozens of cold cases before stepping away. Doug inspected the lens through a magnifier. Late 90s film stock, he said. Fuji, maybe Kodak Max. These things are built to last, but this one's been through heat, or time. You think it could survive 14 years in the dirt? Mark asked. Doug nodded. Just barely, especially if it was shallow at first and gradually buried by runoff. He turned over the housing piece and blinked at the warped, burned sticker. This place shut down in '08. You're looking at a very narrow window. Whoever owned this camera likely had it right before they vanished. Mark brought the findings to his captain again, but the reaction didn't change. Interesting artifacts, the captain muttered. But chasing myths isn't your job. No suspects. No leads. No bodies. This case has been ice cold since before you joined the force. Mark didn't argue. He didn't have to. His mind was made up. And as far as he was concerned, the case was active. At least it was for him and for Frank. That weekend, the two of them returned. This time, they weren't empty-handed. They brought a metal detector, not official equipment. Mark had borrowed it from a buddy who volunteered with search and rescue teams. It was scuffed up and old, but working. Back at the same ridge where they'd found the lens, Frank led the way again. The forest felt heavier now. Shadows pooled deeper under branches. After 10 minutes of scanning, the detector gave a soft blip, then a stronger alert. Mark marked the spot and started to dig slowly to avoid damaging evidence. About 10 inches down, beneath roots and densely packed dirt, Mark struck something solid. Not rock, plastic. He dug around it carefully, inch by inch, until the object came loose. It was a compact flash card, chipped, melted at the corners, but unmistakable. An old 128 mm SanDisk, the kind used in digital cameras from the early 2000s. The casing was warped by heat or age, maybe both. Mark held it up to the light, brushed off the grime. Maybe the memory was fried. Maybe it was completely blank, or maybe it held moments from the last days of the Campbell family. Back in town, Mark called Doug again. "This might be wishful thinking," he said, laying the card on Doug's work counter. Doug let out a slow whistle. "Where'd this come from?" "You don't want to know," Mark replied. Doug plugged in an older adapter, muttering softly under his breath as he hooked it to the computer. The fan spun up and for a moment, nothing. Then a chime. A folder opened. Inside were 12 photo files. 7 were damaged, partially corrupted. Static-filled thumbnails, blank frames. But 5 pictures opened. They weren't high resolution. They weren't sharp, but they were real. One showed a family smiling at a roadside diner. Another caught a teenage boy flashing a peace sign in front of a forest trail. A third featured a woman with dark hair in a red flannel coat, holding a map in the van's front seat. And then came the last one. It was a landscape, an overlook of a forested valley. Rolling hills, dusk shadows. But in the corner of the frame, barely tucked in the edge, was a man. He wore a tan jacket. Something long dangled from his hand. Maybe a stick, maybe a tool. He didn't seem to pose. Didn't seem to belong. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't part of the family. And he was staring directly into the lens. Into whoever held that camera. Mark froze. He'd followed a hunch into the wilderness, guided only by old instincts, and a dog who never stopped looking. He wasn't chasing ghosts. He was chasing the truth. And it had just blinked back at him from a photo. 14 years old. Now Mark had something solid. Not just theories or scattered fragments. He had photos that placed the Campbell family deep within the woods, far beyond where anyone had thought to look. He had part of their camera, a melted flash card with snapshots of their final days. And in one of those frames, a stranger, staring back through time. He wasn't chasing what-ifs anymore. This was real. Frank let out a soft exhale beside him and leaned gently against Mark's leg. "We're close, boy," Mark murmured. "Closer than we've ever been." The sun was starting to drop behind the tree line when Frank came to an abrupt stop. They'd been trekking the ridgeline for over an hour, following nothing more than Frank's instincts and what felt like an invisible thread. But Mark had long since decided he trusted Frank more than any satellite map or database. Frank's body language shifted from observation to intent. Ears up, eyes sharp, posture firm. Mark followed silently. They stopped at the edge of a steep slope, cluttered with thorny brush, partially buried boulders, and a mess of old roots. Below the ledge, a flat patch of forest spread eerily still, as if holding its breath. Frank stepped ahead slowly, nose working the air, and circled a spot on the ground about the size of a kiddie pool. Then he sat, perfectly still. Watching, Mark clambered down the rocky incline to his partner's side. "What is it, buddy?" he whispered, though he already knew. Frank didn't sit like this unless he was certain. Mark pressed his gloved hand to the soil. It felt wrong. Not fresh exactly, but recently disturbed. The ground was damp in a way that didn't match the surroundings. Looser, more fragile. He pulled out his multi-tool and gently scraped away the top layer, just enough to disturb what was hidden underneath. Then, clink. His stomach turned as his tool struck a flat, rust-pitted layer of metal, something corroded but curved. Not just debris. This had form. Mark sat back on a rock, took a breath, and looked at Frank. The dog hadn't moved, eyes fixed, ears rigid like a statue planted beside the truth. A section of old, crushed metal peeked out from under a set of tangled roots, the unmistakable curve of a fender. They had found it. 14 years lost in the wilderness, and now the mountain had started to give up its secrets. The following morning, Mark didn't bring it forward as a hunch or possibility. This was a legitimate field discovery, and this time his captain didn't hesitate. Things happened fast. A specialized forensic recovery team was dispatched, along with environmental experts, geologists, county deputies, and eventually, state authorities. Even a drone crew arrived to capture the scene from the air. Within hours, the site had been transformed. Perimeter tape, mobile tents, protective fencing. What had started as an unofficial search was now a full-scale official recovery. Mark knew the quiet wouldn't last. A case this cold, this tragic, would be a media firestorm the moment word got out. Through it all, Frank refused to leave the clearing. Even with the commotion, the machines, the people, he stayed close to the marked spot, barely sipping water, always watching. He wasn't finished. Not yet. The excavation was slow. First by hand tools and shovels, then more precise digging with brushes and small trowels. By sundown, the outline of a vehicle had emerged, bent, collapsed, partially digested by time and mud. The metal looked scorched in places, twisted in others, but the color was unmistakable. Blue. What remained of a Dodge Caravan, the same model the Campbell family had disappeared in. At first, it didn't make sense. The location was too remote. No visible access road, no worn tire tracks, not even an overgrown trail leading in. Then the geologist stepped in with a chilling explanation. 14 years ago, this stretch of forest was prone to landslides, especially during the wet season. And just above their location was a long-abandoned logging road. One wrong turn, one slide, and a vehicle could tumble off the ridge, buried by mud and runoff, sealed away by nature itself. Evidence supported the theory. Broken tree stumps, deep compacted brush, vegetation with unusual growth patterns, some dating back to the exact year the Campbells vanished. The implication was simple and terrifying. The van had slid off the forgotten trail, out of sight, out of reach, buried by the mountainside, forgotten by everyone except a dog and his handler. The real confirmation came when they pried open the rear hatch, crushed inward by years of pressure, but still accessible. It revealed what time hadn't completely erased. 4 skeletal remains. 2 adults remained slumped in the front seats. 2 smaller skeletons lay in the back. The arrangement perfectly matched the family's last known seating layout. No one spoke. The dig site, buzzing all morning, descended into thick silence. Even the wind paused. Frank gave a soft-pained whine and laid his head gently across Mark's boot. DNA testing was still in progress, but no one at the scene needed a lab report to know what they'd found. Mark stood silently above the wreckage, watching as the last of the soil was cleared. The tires were long decayed, the paint had nearly vanished, but the shape, even after all these years, was unmistakable. 14 years ago, a family vanished without a trace. Now, thanks to a single K9, they had come home, but peace didn't last long. As the recovery team continued to work, something unexpected emerged. Around 10 feet from the van, near a sloped rise by a fallen pine, Frank barked again. Once, then again. Short, urgent. Mark rushed to the spot. Frank was digging at the ground with frantic intensity, paws throwing dirt behind him in bursts. Everyone on the crew stopped, turned, and joined them. Within an hour, another discovery surfaced, and it changed everything. A second sight, another body. Smaller, buried awkwardly, half hidden beneath layers of tangled roots. But it wasn't a Campbell. Different clothing, older remains. Whoever this was, they hadn't died in that van. They'd been placed, or left, separately. Confusion rippled through the group. "Who the hell is this?" one of the deputies muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Mark didn't answer. His eyes stayed on Frank, who now paced in tight circles, restless, ears alert. He wasn't calm. He wasn't satisfied. There was more, something deeper than bones or wreckage. Mark felt it crawling beneath his ribs. This wasn't over. Not even close. That night in the motel, while Frank dozed fitfully by the door, twitching at every sound, Mark sat wide awake at the table, surrounded by old maps, scribbled notes, and timelines. The fifth body had twisted everything. Maybe it was a coincidence, a stranger lost in the same unforgiving terrain. Or maybe the Campbells had stumbled into something they never should have seen, and paid for it, because sometimes the forest doesn't just hold secrets, it whispers them, and once it starts, it doesn't stop. On the third morning, the recovery team gathered at the edge of a moss-covered ravine. The air was dense, heavy with silence, as though the forest itself was waiting. Buried in the shallow bed below, like a time capsule unearthed, was the hidden shell of a vanished minivan. The Dodge. 14 years lost. Now found, thanks to K9 Frank's nose. Officer Mark Dalton stood beside him, heart pounding. Frank was still, completely still, staring at the remains like a guard, standing watch over the truth. The license plate confirmed what they'd already feared. Oregon. Tag 42732, the Campbell family's vehicle. It took 2 long days of slow, careful work to fully excavate what was left. The roof had folded inward. The front caved from the impact. It had crashed headfirst into an old creek bed, and years of rain, landslides, and root growth had swallowed it whole. It wasn't that no one had looked, it was that no one had known where to. Inside, the scene was devastating. 4 skeletons, one in the driver's seat. Likely Henry, the other in the front passenger seat, Lisa. In the rear, 2 smaller frames, tangled in collapsed seat belts and scraps of luggage, Jordan and Emily faded backpacks, a dented cooler bag, even the frame of a toy camera, still intact. The past had frozen inside it. Forensics would take time, but the evidence was clear. The Campbells had been here the entire time, but the forest wasn't done speaking. Roughly 10 yards upslope, Frank barked again. Not at metal, not at the van, at earth. Mark followed immediately. Frank stood at the base of a gnarled pine, posture rigid. Mark dropped beside him and started to dig. It didn't take long. The tool hit something. Not steel, not plastic, bone small, fragile. Too small for an adult, yet clearly not a child either. Another skeleton, partially buried, not protected, not intentional, almost like she'd been left, and nature had done the burying. A 5th individual. She was female, older teen maybe. Her clothing didn't match the Campbells. She wore heavier layers, cold weather gear. Whoever she was, her fate felt different. Uneasy silence fell. The Campbells were a family of 4. So, who was she? What had once been a heartbreaking discovery now became something else, something darker. Back at the station, Mark began tearing through local records. He pulled every missing persons report filed within a 3-year window, from 2007 to 2010. Dozens of names, dozens of lives left hanging, but one stood out. Case, Dr. Brian Rasher 1074. Morgan Renee, Tesdale, 17 years old, reported missing, July 8, 2009. Morgan had last been spotted somewhere near Elk Creek. Police reports said she was hitchhiking after a falling out with her parents. Her destination was a mystery. Some thought she might have been trying to reach California, but her family insisted she didn't have the resources to travel that far on her own. What no one realized until now, she vanished exactly 10 days before the Campbell family did. Mark leaned back in his chair, brow furrowed, the pieces circling in his mind. What if she'd accepted a ride from the wrong person? What if their paths crossed? What if she had been with the Campbells? He called in a forensic anthropologist from Portland to examine the newly discovered remains. The findings were disturbing. Morgan Tisdale had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. Her forearms showed defensive wounds, classic signs of someone trying to shield themselves. And a clean fracture in her wrist told another story, one of restraint. This wasn't exposure or accident. This was homicide. Now the case had shifted. A cold disappearance had turned into an active homicide investigation. The FBI reopened the Campbell file. News of the discovery hit national headlines. What once felt like a backwoods mystery now gripped the entire country in the quiet town of Elk Creek, where people had long since stopped asking questions. Everything was buzzing again. Somebody had tried to bury Morgan, literally, but more than that. They had tried to erase her. Someone who knew the backroads, the terrain, the hidden spots that most maps didn't even recognize anymore. Mark and Frank returned to the ridge above the wreck. They didn't have new leads, just instincts. Frank, as always, led the way. He followed a trail through thickets and into what looked like nothing but bramble. Buried beneath overgrowth and rotted pine was a collapsed shed. The roof long caved inward, walls soggy with mold. Frank froze, sniffed, stepped forward. His head dropped at a pile of debris near the back wall. He scratched once, twice. Mark knelt, peeled away the rotted canvas, revealing a half-decayed backpack, soaked and stained from years of exposure. Tucked inside, among water-damaged papers, was a small journal. Faded handwriting trailed across the thin page. Morgan R. Tisdale, July 2009. Mark held it like a brittle artifact. Page after page revealed scattered, fragmented thoughts, fear, hope, and confusion. He said it'd be a quick ride. The family was nice. The little girl shared her snacks. I don't trust him. The man at the gas station. He stared too long. That was the last full sentence. The ink bled off into smudges. Mark took the notebook straight to headquarters. Investigators pored over every word. Photos of Morgan were shown to surviving Campbell relatives. The truth was chilling. Morgan wasn't part of the trip, but she had been at the same diner where the Campbell family was last seen. It was likely she'd been picked up by them, offered a ride, which made her something more than a tragic addition. She had been a witness, and maybe that's why she was buried away from the van. Separated. Silenced. Back at the site, Frank uncovered one last grisly clue. Behind the shed, under damp leaves and rusted fencing, was a length of chain. Its links tangled with what appeared to be strands of hair. Testing confirmed the DNA belonged to Morgan Tisdale. Someone had restrained her here. Someone tried to keep her from telling the world whatever she'd seen. That single chain shifted the entire narrative. What once seemed like a tragic disappearance now stood as an active, unsolved murder, with at least 5 victims and an unknown suspect. Frank hadn't just led them to the van. He'd found a 5th voice. Long buried, nearly forgotten, but not anymore. The air inside the old sawmill was thick with dust and silence. Officer Mark Dalton stepped carefully over a crumbling support beam, flashlight in one hand, K9 Frank beside him, nose twitching. The structure was tucked behind thick undergrowth and rusted-out freight containers, hidden along the ridgeline, lost to time and memory. If you didn't know about it, you'd never find it. And that, Mark thought, was probably the point. Frank moved along the warped walls, sniffing his way through old tools, coiled wire, and broken window glass. He paused at a workbench near the back of the building. Something was there. Mark knelt beside him, pulled a torn tarp aside. Nestled beneath the bench was a plastic-wrapped bundle, double-sealed, protected from moisture and time. Inside, an old digital memory card. Whoever put it there didn't want it ruined. Whoever put it there wanted it hidden. 2 hours later, in a quiet corner of the sheriff's evidence room, Mark sat at a station with the card plugged into a borrowed reader. The laptop processed slowly. Then the folder appeared. One name. Campbell, July 19. Mark hesitated, then clicked. 24 images surfaced. The first few were innocent. Road trip pictures. Smiling kids eating melting ice cream. Henry and Lisa grinning beside a scenic lookout. One showed Emily petting a goat outside a roadside farm. Every timestamp matched the family's final known days before the disappearance. Photos frozen in time, but in one frame, there might be more than memory buried behind the smiles. In the distance, just past where the Campbell family stood smiling by a quiet riverbank, a lone figure appeared. He wasn't part of the scene. He wasn't looking at the family at all. He was looking directly at the camera, tall, mid-40s, white male, scruffy beard, wearing worn work boots, and slung across one shoulder, a chainsaw. Mark's throat went dry. That face. He recognized it. Back at the station, he dove into historical records, employment rosters from 2009, old permit logs for timber operations around the Elk Creek region. He scanned hundreds of lines until a single name froze him in place. Wayne Ellison, Ellison had been hired by a private logging group for selective cutting deep in the restricted foothills. That same company had racked up fines the following year for tree removal well outside legal zones. By the time regulators got involved, the company had shuttered. And Ellison? Dead. Found in his trailer 6 months after the family went missing, heroin overdose. Ruled accidental, no investigation. But Mark saw the bigger picture now. What if the Campbells had taken a wrong turn down a decommissioned road and wandered into something they weren't supposed to see? What if they witnessed Ellison or others in the middle of illegal logging? And what if someone decided they couldn't be allowed to leave? The pieces were no longer scattered. The old photo, the digital card hidden under the sawmill, the journal from Morgan Tisdale, all of it painted a new version of the case. Mark forwarded the evidence, photographs, documents, permit files, to the district attorney's office. Within 48 hours, the Campbell disappearance was reclassified, open, and now a homicide case. But Mark wasn't finished, and neither was Frank. That night, they retraced their steps, this time behind the sawmill deeper into the woods. Frank broke ahead, nose to the ground with a sharp determination. Mark followed in silence, his flashlight flickering across rocks and branches. They crossed a long dry creek bed, climbed a gradual incline. Then Frank stopped. A small clearing, flat stones, soil that didn't belong. Frank sat, ears forward, tail still. Not a sound. Mark scanned the ground. To anyone else it might have looked like nothing. But Mark had seen what certainty looked like in this dog more than once. He crouched, pulled out his phone, and locked in the GPS coordinates. Then he made the call to OBI requesting a full daylight forensic team. The next morning by 9 a.m., investigators were on site. The Oregon Bureau of Investigation brought their specialized cadaver dogs. Just like Frank had done, they marked the spot without hesitation. It was disturbed ground, all right, a shallow grave. The dig team moved carefully, no rushing. Every inch of soil was sifted with precision. 2 hours in, they found something wrapped tight in a weather-worn canvas tarp. When the fabric peeled back, the bones beneath told the story. A young female, estimated age 15 to 17, not one of the Campbells. Another girl, another silence, another life tucked away in the trees. Mark stood, watching in stillness as the medical examiner bagged and labeled what was left behind. For now, they called her Jane Doe. But Mark had a hunch. He went back into the national database, combing through open missing persons files from the summer of 2009. Dozens of names. Hundreds of details, but within the hour, one stood out. Megan Russo, age 16. Last seen July 5th, just 2 weeks before the Campbell family disappeared. She'd been hitchhiking solo, trying to get from Idaho to the Pacific coast, according to her friends. But her final confirmed location, a gas station near Elk Creek, same season, same trail system, same stretch of cursed wilderness. Suddenly, this wasn't just the story of a lost family. This was something deeper. Darker, patterned. Mark brought it to the sheriff's office. "There's more here than we thought," he told the team. "We assumed the Campbells were the first victims, but Megan went missing earlier. Same area, no car, no trace. And now we've found her, just 200 yards from the Campbell's van." He paused, then said the part no one dared speak. "I don't think Wayne Ellison acted alone." The room stilled. Mark clicked his laptop, pulling up photo archives and logging records. 3 names flashed on the screen. Wayne Ellison, the deceased logger, Rick Ballard, a former forest inspector, Dean, Tucker, a local logging supervisor. They all worked in the Elk Creek region that summer. All disappeared from public record before the original investigation ever began, and every one of them had signed the same equipment rental logs that summer: chainsaws, fuel deliveries, and transport trucks. No one spoke, but the meaning was clear. This wasn't just an accident. It was a systematic cover-up, and Frank, the dog, had just cracked it wide open. That night, Mark took Frank back to the ridge, the one near the logging trail, now known as the Campbell's Final Path, a road that should have never been there, a road that should have never shown up on GPS. He stood in quiet reflection, staring into the wall of dark trees. Frank sat beside him, ears perked, breath slow and steady. "We're not done," Mark whispered. He pulled out the final photo, the one from the now famous memory card. The Campbell family, frozen in time, smiling beside that riverbank, and behind them, half hidden in the trees, was a man, scruffy, unsmiling, chainsaw slung across his shoulder, ghost in the background, whose secrets the trees could no longer keep, but he hadn't counted on. Frank. And Frank never forgot the courtroom wasn't filled with news cameras or headlines. This wasn't national yet, but every seat was taken. Retired rangers, old loggers, quiet townsfolk who had lived under a shadow for 14 years without even realizing it. In plain clothes, Officer Mark Dalton sat in the front row. At his feet was Frank, calm, composed, a portrait of silent focus. On the witness stand, Rick Ballard, same worn denim jacket he'd been hauled in wearing, sweat along his browline. His eyes heavy. He'd said nothing since his arrest. Not when the fake logging permits came to light. Not when the shallow grave was tied to his name. But under oath. He finally broke. "I didn't kill them," he muttered. "But I knew." The courtroom went silent. Mark didn't blink. Frank didn't flinch. The truth was surfacing. And it had started with a single bark. 3 months earlier, after DNA confirmed the remains belonged to Megan Russo, the sheriff's office launched a full-scale, multi-jurisdiction investigation. Ellison, long dead, had taken his secrets to the grave. But his insider contact, Ballard, had been hiding in plain sight, living under a new identity just 40 miles from the site. During his confession, Ballard revealed that in 2009 he had helped falsify forestry permits for Ellison and Dean Tucker, granting them illegal access to cut timber deep in restricted land across the Cascade foothills. The road the Campbells had driven? It wasn't just decommissioned, it was never supposed to exist. But GPS doesn't ask for permission, and one wrong turn placed an innocent family inside an illegal operation, a quiet crime hidden beneath trees, and silence. What happened next remained unclear. Forensics couldn't tell if the crash was caused by a pursuit, an ambush, or if they simply panicked and died trying to escape. But one thing was certain. Afterward, somebody buried the evidence. Megan's case revealed even more. Ballard confessed that she had approached them, asking for a ride west. She'd shown up at the camp. She'd seen too much, and according to Ballard, Ellison said only one thing about her: "Handled it. Don't ever bring her up again." What began as one family's disappearance had become a story of violence, secrets, and a broken trail of missing girls, buried behind the splinters of greed and machinery, and uncovered by the loyalty of a single dog who couldn't be fooled. It was Frank who found the bones. Frank who wouldn't stray from truth. Frank who heard the whisper in the woods and barked when no one else was listening. For 14 years, Rick Ballard said nothing, and no one would have ever known the truth if it weren't for Frank. The day the charges were officially read, Mark took Frank back into the woods one last time. This time, it wasn't to track evidence or chase leads. It was just to walk the trail, now that it had a name: the Campbell-Russo Trail. Formally dedicated in memory of the victims and permanently closed to the public, the path had become a symbol, a quiet monument. At the trailhead stood a carved wooden sign, handcrafted by local volunteers. Beneath it, 4 plaques bore the names of the Campbell family. A smaller 5th one read, "Megan Russo, never forgotten, in the clearing." Mark rested one hand gently on Frank's neck. "You did good, buddy," he whispered. "Real good." Frank didn't move, just leaned into him, eyes fixed on the forest ahead. Always alert, always watching. Back in town, things began to shift. The story made local headlines. A few national podcasts picked it up. But for the people of Elk Creek, it was never about notoriety. It was about peace, justice, answers. The state's Department of Forestry set aside funds to clear and decommission dozens of neglected trail roads. GPS mapping companies were contacted to remove or update dangerous paths. New signage warned travelers where the forest shouldn't be entered. More importantly, the state launched a new initiative, a cold case division specializing in K-9-led investigations. And Mark? He got offered a promotion. He turned it down. Not out of pride, but because he knew the truth. There were still more trails, more missing names, more places where the wind whispered stories no one had heard yet. And Frank? He wasn't ready to retire. Neither was Mark. On a crisp October morning, Mark stood in the Oregon Law Enforcement Museum. Behind a clean glass display sat the excavated shell of a van. Not just any van. The Campbell's van. Preserved as part of a special exhibit honoring cold cases solved by K-9 units. The exhibit included one simple but powerful photo, recovered from a melted memory card. The last known image of the family, the Campbells, stood by the water's edge. The kids were barefoot. The sunlight glowed across their faces. Lisa Campbell had extended her hand, taking the photo just seconds before the shutter clicked. They didn't know what was coming, but Mark knew then. They deserved to be remembered for how they lived, not just how they died, for the smiles they left behind. That evening, just as twilight brushed the tops of the trees, Mark and Frank returned to the trail. It had become their tradition, one that mattered. Every year, on the anniversary of the day Frank found the van, Mark would return and plant a new wildflower beside the memorial. This time, he brought purple lupine, Lisa's favorite. Her sister had told him once. He knelt in the dirt, gently planting the roots with cupped hands, pressing the earth down with quiet care. Frank sat nearby, head tilted, watching with those same intelligent, soulful eyes. Mark wiped the sweat from his forehead and stood. "I don't know how many more we've got left in us," he said softly, "but I know this much. We're not done yet." Frank let out a low bark, a quiet yes in a language only the two of them understood. Mark smiled. Then together, step by step, they turned back toward the trailhead.